Dementia Researcher with a blog and a rating.
Hi everybody, my name's Becky Carlyle, and today I'm going to be reading my Dementia Researcher blog on how I started my own lecture course. Firstly though, for those of you who are regular listeners, apologies for the slightly lower quality of audio compared to my usual blogs. I'm currently hiding out in Yorkshire away from the heatwave as my son's school is closed for the rest of the week. So, to the blog. One of the most important roles we have as dementia researchers is to educate and inspire the next generation of scientists. I was somewhat dismayed when I started teaching neuroscience to second-year Oxford medics that the part of the syllabus that deals with dementia hasn't really changed since I was at medical school, and that was a very long time ago. The basic fact is that while the central theories about dementia hold, almost everything swirling around them has changed. So, when I was given the opportunity to increase my teaching portfolio by teaching a new lecture course to second-year biomedical scientists, I should have said, absolutely not, I'm completely overwhelmed. But instead, I said, sounds amazing, sign me up. It has been a lot of work. But 3 students from the course have just finished their first short research projects in my lab, and it has been a really positive culmination to a really good teaching year. Running a course really forces you to ask the super basic questions in our field, such as, do we really know that? How do we know that? Who figured it out? And are there any big gaps? In a way that you simply don't have the bandwidth to consider when you're rushing from grant to grant. I firmly believe it improves my grasp of the field and gives me far better context for what we're doing in the lab. But it is a lot. And so in this blog, I'm going to run through a few of the guiding principles I used when creating this course from scratch, in a hope to inspire more of you to step forwards and teach students the up-to-date scientific knowledge they need to push our field forwards. My first piece of advice would be to teach mostly what you know, alongside a small handful of things that you always wished you'd had the time to figure out. My course is called The Molecular Basis of Neurodegenerative Disease and Dementia, which means that for most of the lectures, the study techniques and the foundational experiments are firmly in my wheelhouse. But we don't cover only RNA and proteins. Much to the chagrin of a young man who came to the first lecture and then was never seen again, we start by discussing clinical diagnosis, the huge amount of variability clinicians see in people with dementia, and the difficulties that this poses for diagnosis. In my mind, as a molecular biologist, this is essential information for understanding the leading edge of molecular discovery in neurodegeneration, and starts the course with a clear rationale for continued advances in biomarkers and deeper understanding of molecular mechanism. The look of shock on the students' faces as we went through the current dementia diagnosis toolkit suggested it was a really important lesson in understanding where our biosamples arise from and the tough decisions that clinicians make in limited time to categorize people. Of course, it's then instantly obvious why having a biochemical marker of a disease state might help this diagnosis. With the exception of the young gentleman above, with an aversion to just more psychology stuff, the students were hooked. From there on in, we explored both the history and current status of molecular dementia research, starting with insoluble proteins and disease models, moving through recent big papers in single-cell RNA sequencing and proteomics, and using these to launch 3 themed lectures: metabolism, neuroinflammation, and excitatory inhibitory balance. The final lecture took 3 clinical trials that had either recently completed or were currently underway, looked at their scientific rationale, clinical trial design and inclusion criteria, and finished by discussing how biomarkers might inform rational trial design. At each stage, students were expected to build their knowledge of the scientific techniques employed to achieve the discovery, to consider the relevance of the models and the samples used, and to embrace the complexity and uncertainty thrown up by deep molecular characterization of these complex disorders. In small group tutorials, we argued for and against hypotheses, amyloid, prions, the utility of mouse models, and students learned how to use primary evidence to formulate these scientific arguments. I had an absolute blast teaching this course, and the reviews from the students were mostly very positive. Many commented on how unusual it was to see papers from the last 2 years in a lecture, despite the fact that when they become practicing scientists in a few years' time, putting brand new papers in context of the historical literature is one of the most important skill sets they will require. Those of you who know me will know that my public persona is somewhat energetic, and I think the students appreciated the genuine enthusiasm of not knowing something and enjoyed the prompts to get them to plot out ways to figure it out. A few things to consider along the way. If your students are in the first part of their academic journey, they've probably received pretty basic teaching on many of the systems you're going to cover, and so you'll have to ensure you cover some of these bases first. Metabolism is a great example, where the students hadn't heard about some of the glial neuronal shuttles and why different cells might use different fuels under different conditions. Make sure you check out the syllabus for what they've already covered in their courses, and that you proactively plug any gaps in the teaching that you might need for them to understand a disease state. Similarly, most lectures are online these days, so make sure you're not repeating material they've already heard too frequently. Be clear on what you want students to take away from your lectures, and that you give opportunities for students of all strengths to succeed. A big part of this is providing good handouts with direct links to the reviews and primary literature that you quote, which gives the top students the opportunity to go and check out full papers and further contextualize their learning. I've kind of given up summarizing things with bullets for many of my scientific talks, but these summaries are essential for the weaker students to ensure they have understood the drive of the argument, and it will enable them to revisit the material and further their understanding outside of the rapid-fire lecture format. Still, don't give away absolutely everything in the handouts. Keep some things as discussed in the lecture only, so that the students who attend and fully engage will benefit more widely from the experience. When it comes to examining, set your questions with these different levels of students in mind. A question such as, outline the key arguments against the amyloid hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease, allows the weaker student to pass by bulking out your bullet summaries, and the stronger students to use primary evidence to make their argument, and the best to write a well-rounded appraisal which takes in alternative hypotheses and highlights key experimental evidence across the board. In this scenario, everyone who understands the broad argument passes, and the top students get to show they are thinking deeply in creative ways about the topic. While you're marking the exams, be self-reflective. For example, I noticed a few students put a lot of weight on one of the clinical trials we covered in the final lecture as a competing mechanism to amyloid, and this arises from the fact that I hadn't made it clear that I'd essentially picked trials at random from different subcategories of trial to highlight. I didn't necessarily believe that evidence for this particular mechanism was particularly strong. There were a few occasions like that where I realized that even though you say the science is open for discussion every lecture, your word really is taken as ground truth by a subset of students, and it's important to recognize this when you're talking. I will be taking this reflection and others forward to next year, where the slides and the flow will stay generally the same, but I will tweak the way I introduce certain ideas. 3 easy final things. Number 1. Of course, always check the work, but I found that ChatGPT was really good for identifying the first person to do a certain thing. Especially when it comes to major evidence along the amyloid pathway, much of this was accepted knowledge when I started to think about dementia, and so the path of discovery was not always clear to me. ChatGPT really helped here. Number 2, related to this, it's really quite common that lots of people were working on the same thing at the same time, and you can't cover it all. You can therefore make a choice to highlight the work of specific people who may come from underrepresented groups, for example, or who are just known to be an all-round good egg. For example, we had a brief aside in the neuroinflammation lecture to talk about Ben Barrs and their article on how to pick a graduate advisor before we moved on to their work on reactive astrocytes. And then 3, at the end of each lecture, I highlighted Oxford-based researchers and highly rated supervisors working on this aspect of neurodegeneration, giving the students links to labs they may want to join for future research projects and internships. I hope this also provides valuable help for colleagues and departments without undergraduate teaching portfolios. It's a serious job to be educating the scientists of the future, and one not to be taken lightly. I'm of the firm belief that courses like this early on in their careers will inspire students to join the fight against dementia, or to equip them with reasoning skills and practices that will benefit them whatever field of research or work they choose. Lecturing makes it more likely you'll inspire excellent students to come and work in your lab, and raises your profile amongst the research community as your students ripple out to other labs. I'm pretty hopeful that I'm starting to create excellent PhD students who may come eventually to work in my lab, and if they don't, then hopefully you'll see some of them in yours. The students are awesome, and I'm excited to see how far they'll go.
Thank you for listening. Join the Dementia Research bloggers and share your own views.